Okay. Does it work? So, okay. Welcome to Bruegel. My name is Georg Zachmann. I'm a senior fellow at Bruegel, and today we are discussing how national energy policy plans are feeding into the European decarbonization agenda. And the setup will be as follows. We will first have a panel of presentations, starting with Alexandra Gawlikowska-Fyk from Forum Energia, a Polish think tank that deals strongly with decarbonization in Poland and the energy transition in this country, and has done great work on bringing all stakeholders together to discuss this matter. Then there will be a presentation by Carole Mathieu from Ivry, a French think tank, and that is working also on energy, but also on international relations, and she'll present a French perspective. And finally, Christian von Hirschhausen, full disclaimer, he's my former CESA supervisor, so I have to be a bit careful. And he will present the German experience and the German planning. Now, why is it such an important topic? So first of all, we were quite surprised to have such a relatively large crowd. So we were expecting less people for this topic, I have to say. And I think the reason why some of you came and why it's an important question right now is that now all national energy and climate plans have been submitted. So the European Commission asked the member states to submit plans for 2030. What are they planning in terms of energy and climate policy? And these plans are now on the table. And now is the time for the member states to discuss among each other on how those national plans fit together, and for the Commission to give recommendations by the end of June on how the member states should adjust their plans in order to make sure that the national plans are well coordinated among each other, but also to make sure that the national plans together fit very well into the European objectives. So it's an important point in time to have this discussion. And we try to bring together 3 countries here, not to have 28, that can give an interesting look into the national peculiarities. And what you see here on the screen is essentially that the arrows are now going in the wrong direction, so you have to think that they are in the other direction.
You need to ask. There it is.
Okay. So for some formatting reasons. So okay. No, we are not. So here we are going backwards in time, but we want to go forward in time. So the idea is that that what you see is that, for example, Germany already went the longest way in, or plans to go the longest way between 2017 and 2030. But France and Poland also both want to go towards more renewables. Both Germany and France are planning to reduce the share of nuclear energy. And if you compare that, again, with the arrows in the wrong direction, it looked right on my screen. I'm very sorry for that. It's very confusing. The point here is that what you see is that Germany indeed went the longest way already from 2000 to 2015, and plans to go quite a long way until 2030. And what is interesting is essentially that is what is based on the data of the European Commission of the EUCO 2030, EUCO 3030. And what you see here is that the plan, the National Energy and Climate Plan, essentially goes further than what the European Commission proposed, or what the European Commission scenarios would imply. For the other countries, for France and Poland, the European Commission scenario is more ambitious than what the countries have in their National Energy and Climate Plans. And we will share these slides in a correct format. Now, What we also see is in these national energy and climate plans, the ideas about electricity exchanges in the future. And I found it quite interesting that Germany, for example, plans to continue to be a heavy exporter of electricity until 2040, and that until 2030, essentially, the current exports are expected to stay high as they are. While the Polish plan essentially foresees that the country does neither import nor export electricity, while France does not make any projections about that, which might be an interesting discussion to have about how do national plans about importing and exporting of electricity will fit together. And finally, a final slide from my side on the capacities of interconnectors. So what you see here, and is essentially that both the interconnectors between Germany and France and the electricity interconnector between Poland and Germany are expected to be increased significantly in the German plan. So it will be very interesting to see whether those plans actually materialize. Now, with that kind of more overview sort of presentation that should give you a bit an idea of the direction of travel, I would like to give the floor to Alexandra.
We have the presentation.
It should be up.
Welcome to everyone, and thank you for having me here today. It's indeed an interesting topic, and I am surprised that there are so many people here in the room. That's especially difficult when you present the Polish perspective in Brussels, but as Georg mentioned, I am working for energy think tank, which is Forum Energy, and which is quite progressive when it comes to Poland. Our aim is to support the implementation of 2020 and 2030 goals. So this is what we're doing. In Poland, we're trying to gather all the different stakeholders and try to explain what's inside Poland, what's going on in the EU, and outside of Poland, what's going on in Warsaw. So my presentation will be both about maybe I'll start here, about the energy policy and about the NECP, because what happened in Poland is that the governance regulation and the need to submit the NECP actually triggered the discussion about the national energy policy. And since this is the dominant document and this is the driving one in Poland and mostly devoted to electricity sector, it comes, let's say, first in the debate, and it was mostly debated, more debated than in NECP. It came just before COP24 in Katowice last year. But before we go there to 2030 landscape, I would like to briefly present you some information, just 2 slides on what's going on in Poland right now. So this is not a secret that Poland is heavily dependent on coal, both hardcore and lignite. And what you see here is electricity production in the last decade. No significant change behind us. But still we have to remember that we are going from almost 100% of coal to right now 78.1 in last year. So this was both lignite and hardcore production. At the same time, you see here, I will show it here if possible, yes, the yellow line, this is gas consumption. It is also significantly growing in Poland lately, and some renewables, mostly wind, but there, and this is the second slide, actually the last year, 2018, was the first year when the production of renewables went down. It was mostly, as we see it in forum, as we discussed it, because it's not that easy to find a good solution. Of course, we can mention politics, but it's not the full picture. There were 2 most important issues, or quite important when we see that. First was the stallment on new investments, and it of course came as a let's say, lower support from the current government towards renewables, especially wind. At the same time, we saw the worse weather conditions. So these were two issues that we saw last year. And what happened also, and this is going fast, despite that the line is very thin at the moment, is this yellow line. These are PVs. There actually the installation of PVs is growing very, very fast in Poland. This is something that we need. We had a problem with summer peaks, and that's why this is the solution that it's mostly accepted. The numbers are low, but still the rate is high. So we are there at the moment. Not a very bright picture. And we are just before the discussion what will happen, what will be the turn in Poland's energy policy. And we had two documents that I mentioned. The one was energy policy until 2040. It was presented just before COP in November. The consultation lasted until the mid-January. And on the same day, on the last day of the consultation, Poland presented, in Poland of course, because it was sent to the Commission earlier, a national energy and climate plan up to 2030 with some data prolonged until 2040 to have these documents compatible. So this is the documents that we have. Both are drafts. Of course, you know that NECP is a draft, but also energy policy is a draft. We're having right now a very big conference in Poland, economic one, and we expected Minister of Energy to present some new data on this draft. Even some thought it would be a new, already governmental, supported by the whole government policy. It is not yet. It's still some additional information, but no big changes. So what's in this energy policy? And you can, of course, think about it as about the NECP and what's in NECP. It's not one-to-one, but mostly it is. As you see, energy security is driving force behind decisions in Poland regarding energy, and this can be seen in electricity sector in many aspects. Coal is still regarded as a maybe not a backbone of energy security, but still as a very, very valid fundament. That's why you see here the first point, below 60% share of coal in 2030. This is something that the government sees as both objective and indicator of the policy. When it comes to renewables, it's 21% in free sector, so it translates to 27% in power sector. The government sustained its decision that, or the previous government decision that Poland will introduce nuclear in 2033. When someone reads the policy, there's an even short executive summary in English, and there is the sentence I read that in the morning, that nuclear appears when there is a need to substitute for withdrawn capacity. So this is something that you can read in the energy policy, and I will get back to this in the conclusions. The third goal, the third EU goal for 2030, the second is energy efficiency, 23% by 2030, and the goal of greenhouse gas reduction is 30% by 2030. So these are aims that are both in energy policy and in ECP. How the electricity, I put here only the production, it would be too long to discuss generation capacity and the production. So this is production by until 2040. So what do you see here? First of all, until 2030, not much happens. After 2030, we see the introduction of nuclear, speed decrease of lignite, which is going to be tough for Poland. We don't need to call a commission to decide about it, because the resource depletion decides about coal phase out, lignite phase out in Poland. We see offshore wind that it's supposed to come in mid-2020s, but we will see more of that in 2030s. And the massive support for PVs. Of course, when it comes to production, there's less. When it comes to generation, it's much, much more. And we see decrease in onshore wind, but this is something that the government actually immediately withdrawn from. So we will see also new auctions for wind and probably at least some repowering of existing wind farms. It depends. It depends on political future decisions, so it's not yet well defined. Major decisions, difficult decisions are, let's say, pushed to 2030s. So this is how it is in the mix. Quite substantial electricity demand. There's an expectation of EVs coming and electrification of heating. We think in our think tank, we think that this is too high. We think that there should be more measures on that, energy efficiency, but also better sector coupling. And sector coupling in this meaning is not, I think it's a bit different. Of course, you can define sector coupling on many different ways, but in Poland, I would see it more as electricity plus heating plus transport. It's not electricity plus gas as a main issue at the moment. It might be so. Of course, we will discuss it, but what it's needed is simultaneous discussion about heating, transport, and electricity in Poland. In this way, we can achieve much, much more. This is what we see. Emissions. What is presented in the energy policy, this is the average emissions from the power sector. You see here that, again, this is after 2030 that the emissions will go down more than or from this path dependency due to launching the nuclear. This is the idea of the government. However, the problem is here until 2030 or even earlier, because what will happen, the overall emissions will go up in Poland with this kind of mix, simply because electricity production will go up. So this is something that we will observe, and there are already 2 years in a row that Poland increased its emissions, overall emissions, but also emissions from the power sector. Data for it's slight for electricity, but it's visible. Of course, transport that is in Germany is driving the emissions up, but well, we do have a problem there. With this, we also think that with renewables, the study we did at Forum was an alternative scenario to that. We see that it's already possible to go down to 550 grams in 2030, before 2030. This is about the emissions, and I have 2 slides with conclusions. What does it mean? We think that, of course, it is difficult for Poland to say, hello, we will decarbonize tomorrow. Nevertheless, we think that this kind of mix, it is kind of progressive when we compare the previous energy policies, but still it does not take sufficient account of EU targets and regulations. This electricity mix that was presented does not take into account the winter package, for example, and EPS standard. It was going on in the same time. Of course, the direction was known, but it is not included there. So it will change energy and electricity mix in Poland, of course. We think that the modeling was done, the results, I'm not trying to say that they were different, but when you see the lack of onshore, which is in the auctions, was much cheaper last year in Poland So this is something that we think that this kind of mix does not really allow for cost and price optimization. High rate of electricity demand, I mentioned that. Imports. We saw those zeros that you presented, Georg, and of course I understand that this can be done for a modeling phase, that TSO, of course there's a TSO responsible for national security, and assume or at the certain stage of modeling that we need to have capacity, internal capacity, domestic capacity, especially when we are a country that has a border with the EU border. So we don't have open borders with other countries, and it's important to have domestic production. Nevertheless, assuming zero, it's not that the reality will show that it will come different. And what I can mention here is that last year Poland had the record high imports of electricity. So this is we already see that. I think that I can leave it here. And what are the risks? Delays or lack of commissioning of nuclear will create a big gap of adequacy, resource adequacy in Poland. If it's not on time and lignite will disappear, then we have problem. Other risk, and already observed last year, is costs and of course wholesale prices. This kind of mix leaves Poland highly vulnerable to rise of CO2 prices, which are imminent. Assuming zero imports in Excel may mean immense imports or unlimited imports in reality. And the other problem is highly important for Poland, imports of coal. Also record high imports last year and record low exports from Poland. So this is not a policy, an ECP or energy policy is not making a U-turn in Poland, but we know that the big change hangs in the balance in the moment, and this is what we can read from data, and we will see how the discussion evolves this year, especially that we have elections each and every EU country right now, but also national elections in October or November at climate, smog, coal, gas, coal imports, electricity imports, electricity prices. These are major topic that has never been so visible in the discussion as they are at the moment. So thank you for the attention, and that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alexandra, for both introducing the Polish plan and also assessing a bit from your perspective what the risks are and the uncertainties around this plan. There are a couple of interesting things for me, and dive into that deeper. I would like now to give the floor to Carol to.
So, thank you, Georg. Thanks to all of you for being here. I hope you hear me well. First, I should start by saying that IFRI is independent from the French government. I'm not a civil servant, I'm a researcher. So I will try to present the French energy plan, but in non-official terms. I will try to provide contextual elements to explain where the decisions come from, and of course, for today's discussion, try to highlight the more regional or EU dimension with this energy plan. So our starting point here is the release of two major draft documents. So first, the long-term decarbonisation strategy, SNBC, in December 2018, which is actually showing the way forward to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And this carbon neutrality objective is now being introduced in the law. The law has not been adopted yet, but it has been presented to the government, and we expect a final adoption by the end of 2019. And the second big piece of documentation is the multi-year energy plan, so PPE, Programmation Pluriannuelle de l'Énergie, which is actually showing the changes in the energy mix between 2019 and 2028, with an interim step in 2023. So roughly all of this is in line with the NECP timeline, because these two documents are draft documents. They are under consultation at the moment, and they should be finalized and adopted by decree by the end of the year, so on time for the submission of the final NECP. So before we jump to electricity, I think it's worth saying a few words about the overall energy and, in fact, climate ambition. So this is mostly from this long-term decarbonisation strategy. Without surprise, the document shows that the most important change for the timeline 2030-2050 will be a sharp drop in energy consumption. That's the key main driver, of course, based on strong energy efficiency efforts and energy conservation efforts, circular economy principles, etc. So going beyond energy policy. Then decarbonized electricity will become the dominant energy vector, while fossil fuels should be phased out. And bioenergies, so biomass, biofuels, renewable gas are expected to play a complementary role. And it is also the case for renewable heat. So that's the key trends that we should observe over the next decades. Now, how do we go there? Because one of the central challenge will be to reduce this energy consumption, and if it is a trend for 2050, of course, you should start reducing energy consumption drastically for the next decades. So it has implications for this midterm document, the PPE, forecasting energy changes for 2028. The graph shows how final energy demand is expected to decrease between 2010 and 2028. So final energy consumption should decrease by 7% in 2023 and by 14% in 2028 compared to 2012 levels. And there are sub-targets for fossil fuels, a decrease by 40% by 2030. So this is quite ambitious, and to reach these targets you have several policy measures envisaged in the plan. I should start by saying that the first one is carbon pricing, carbon taxation, of course for the ETS sector, so the EU part, but also for the non-ETS sectors, and there we come to the discussion on carbon taxation. The objective was to have a progressive increase in carbon taxation for non-ETS sectors and reach 86 euros per ton in 2022. But as you probably know, the planned increase for 2019 has been frozen or even cancelled after the Gilets jaunes protests. And so up to now we are at a level of 45 euros per ton. And the initial plan was to go to 58 euros in January 2019. This has not been the case, and for now there is no clarity on carbon taxation for the coming years. The ground debate is over, and the first conclusions have been given by the French president, but no single word on carbon taxation. It seems that taxation as such has become a difficult issue, so at least for now we don't know at all what will be the strategy for the next years, and if carbon pricing will play its role for achieving the energy consumption targets. This being said, the government is still pushing for energy efficiency measures. There are plans for improving energy efficiency in buildings, support for high-performing heating systems. The white certificate schemes is continued over the next period, so beyond 2021, and also for the European part, EU emission standards are also expected to reduce consumption from the automotive sector. And there are some measures also to support car sharing in France and other similar measures. So it's a policy package, but because of the carbon pricing part, we still don't know whether it's in line with the policy targets. Now turning to electricity, I think it's important to just say a few words about the current situation. So, of course, as it is well known, France is highly dependent on nuclear for its electricity production. It's about 45% of installed capacity, but 72% of total production in last year, 2018. It comes with two major advantages for France. The first one is that the electricity mix is more than 90% decarbonized, which is also helpful when it comes to total GHG emissions for the country. France is ranked quite well among G7 countries, for example, for GHG emissions. And the second aspect is about energy prices and the fact that retail electricity prices in France are lower than the EU average, 15% for households, according to Eurostat figures, for example. So this is the starting point. But it's important to note that a new consensus has been forged in France, and this is reflected in the PPE document. Dependence on nuclear is considered excessive. The 72% share is broadly too much, at least for the next decades, and almost everyone, even probably including nuclear operators, see the opportunity to have a more diversified, balanced electricity mix for the future. So the idea is that nuclear should be reduced to 50% and leave room for renewables, which are becoming more competitive, and also develop new industries in the country. Yet reducing the share of nuclear should not come at the expense of, first, security of supply, and second, climate protection. This is why the 50% target has been shifted to 2035 instead of 2025. This is because the official justification is that sticking to 2025 would have meant building new gas stations. Accepting that the carbon performance of the French power system would be decreased. So this is why the government chose to postpone this target by 10 years. But despite this postponement, now we have much more clarity on how this will be implemented. There are very detailed elements in the PPE on capacity closures. The first important step will be closing the 2 reactors at the Fessenheim station, so close to the German border. This will be done by spring 2020, and in every situation. It's even in the Aachen Treaty between France and Germany, so it will happen. Then the second step will be closing down all 4 coal stations, so that's not much compared to other countries, but it's 35% of total CO2 emissions from the power sector. So it's an important improvement. All of them should be closed by 2022, and now emission standards are being introduced in the law. So if this law is adopted in 2019, then the coal stations become uncompetitive in 2022 and they will close. So it's not administrative closures, but the result will be the same. Then the next step will be to close 2 nuclear reactors in 27 and 28. And an interesting element of the plan is that it includes a specific clause that you could call a German clause, which says that possibly 2 additional reactors could be closed in 2025, 2026, if the regional context is favorable. So it's difficult to understand what it means, but basically a prerequisite would be that Germany goes with its coal phase-out plans and that it has very concrete elements going in this direction, and perhaps then the French government could make another step toward Germany and close these nuclear power stations earlier than foreseen. This being said, in total, 14 reactors should be closed by 2035 to reach the 50% target. At this point in time, we don't know which reactors will be closed. The draft PPE, asks EDF to submit a list. And what we know for now is that no stations will be closed apart from Fessenheim. So it will be 1 reactor here and there to minimize the social impact. And we also know from EDF that, of course, they will take into account safety, the investments necessary for each reactor. So, of course, the oldest ones will be on the list, probably. But other aspects, such as climate change and the impact on nuclear will also be taken into account. So, for example, nuclear stations on the Rhone River will probably be primary targets for this future list. I think another important aspect with the PPE is that it somehow validates the idea of extending the technical lifetime of reactors, so beyond 40 years. 40 years is not an official limit, but there are 10-year inspections. So there is an open question on whether reactors will go beyond 40 years. But with the targets presented in the PPE, the assumption is that if the Nuclear Safety Agency gives green light for technical life extension, then it will be the case, and it's in line with the government's position. In any case, the average age of reactors in France is an important parameter. The average age is 31 years old. 75% of all French reactors will reach this 40 years threshold by 2030. This is because all of them have been built in less than 25 years. So on the graph you see how French nuclear capacity would change if you assume a 40-year technical lifetime. Of course, the capacity will not decrease as sharply because extensions will probably be approved because there is this massive investment program called Grand Carénage to improve safety standards, modernize the reactors, and make sure that the Nuclear Safety Agency gives the green light. But in any case, even if you assume a maximum 60-year technical lifetime, then your conclusion is that 50 gigawatts of nuclear capacity will have to be put offline by 2050. So a fair assumption is that you will go for a progressive phase out of these reactors. Not all of them will reach 60 years or even 50 years. And it's a good option to actually start decommissioning reactors, some reactors quite early on, as the PPE suggests, be able first to manage the social impact and first to anticipate and replace capacities progressively and avoid this cliff edge effect or risk. The conclusion is that beyond 2030 or 2035, we will need a new decarbonized electricity production means in France. It's clear from the graph that we had before on the screen. What is less clear is what production means will be built. Will it be renewables plus storage or other decarbonized flexibility sources, or will it be renewables plus new nuclear? So this is for 2030, 2035, but in fact, if you want the second option, so renewables plus nuclear, to be a credible option, then you have some implications, because there is a risk that the industrial capacity disappears. It's already a proven risk, and it's already experienced with the EPR one. But if there's no perspective for the nuclear industry, then you can doubt the fact that they will be ready to and effective in building new reactors. The second point is that you need to take into account the long delivery time. In official terms, from EDF terms, you need close to 10 years between the decision, so the investment decision, and the commissioning of the first pair of reactors. And then EDF says that they would have the capacity to build one reactor every 1 or 2 years. So it means that if you want to replace totally the capacity by 2050, or build at least, 10 reactors or more, then you need to start with the first one by 2030 or 2035. The conclusion is that the discussion on new built nuclear will have to come quite soon in France. And this is actually quite clear in the PPE, because it says that by mid-2021 the government has to gather all elements, so of course with industrial players, with their plans, to be able to take an informed decision on what production means should be favored for beyond 2030, 2035. So of course, when they say mid-2021, it means that no decision will be taken before the next presidential election. So basically the idea is that France has to come clear on the long-term role of nuclear after the next presidential election in 2022. So it's difficult to say whether the government will go in one direction or the other, but at least we can try to identify key factors that will play a role, I think. Well, obviously, a prerequisite, I think, for the French nuclear industry to be credible and present its offer would be the commissioning of the Flamanville APR by mid-2020, as planned now. But as you probably know, it's still quite unsure, and there are still discussions with the Nuclear Safety Agency on the wells and the additional works that could be needed, might be needed. If it's the case, then the schedule could be again postponed, which would, I think, make very difficult the discussion on new build nuclear, obviously. Another aspect, but I think perhaps less decisive, is the implementation of Hinkley Point C project. Then it depends, of course, on the ability of the French nuclear industry to define a competitive EPR2. So they have highlighted several cost reduction drivers, more standardized production, digital engineering, well, many elements that could help them define a more competitive offer, but it is still an open question. And I think it comes with the need to define a robust waste management strategies, because our storing sites have been designed for the existing fleet, with the assumption that they would go to 50 years technical lifetime. So there needs to be a discussion on the future of nuclear waste management. I think industrial sovereignty will also play a role. So, of course, employment. According to the nuclear industry, and it's actually in the paper as well, but it's 220,000 jobs, and mainly highly qualified jobs, maybe compared to other decarbonized industries. The high qualified part could be a difference. And also, of course, the French industry is planning the full range of nuclear activities. There could be an external dimension. Of course, if France phases out nuclear, the export strategy, I think, would be put to an end, and this has implications for international relations, let's say. And then, final word on the regional EU dimension. Of course, France will look at neighboring countries' experience, including the success of Germany in phasing out both nuclear and coal. If Germany is successful and decarbonizes its electricity mix with renewables and decarbonized flexibility sources, then maybe it could incentivize France to go in this direction or not. I think then we have a market design discussion, because the financial costs are an important part of the competitiveness for nuclear. So in any case, there will be a discussion on the risk-sharing schemes, so basically state aid discussions. So it will involve the European Commission and other member states. And the last point I want to say is that I think this market design discussion should not be seen isolated from the discussion on climate. If we all conclude on the need to go for carbon neutrality by 2050, then of course the nuclear has a case to make, and it could be it could have implications on the choices we make for market design. That's it, because I think it's already too late. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Carol. Again, very fascinating and great that you made this transition to the German case and the success or non-success of the Energiewende. So, Christian, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, for the invitation, and also for the possibility to discuss bilateral, trilateral European issues. Also interesting we come to this in the second round to discuss, for example, I wasn't aware, but it's an interesting idea to kind of trade off closures between coal and natural gas and nuclear. What I will do in the next 10 minutes is to provide an overview of the German situation, but I'll put this into the European context. And actually, as I announced to Georg, this is a shameless marketing for the book that we have just published. But actually it combines the Energiewende in Germany with the European context. Since we're in Europe here, I will start with this. The book itself has 3 parts. I will summarize part 3 on Europe first, and then come to the NECP and what's happening in Germany. As Caroline, I need to say that I'm talking on my own behalf, and I will give some normative aspects as I go along. Let's start with Europe. Here, and I brought this map because, first of all, I love Europe. I'm truly European. My wife is French. I love France. I love the low prices. I'm a little bit worried about the 50 billions that EDF is sucking up from the state budget, but that's not my problem. We also see that Europe is diverse and colorful, and that's normal. Energy policies and the energy mix is a national prerogative, and that's the way it is. So France is red, Poland, as we've heard, is lignite and hard coal. Germany is the combination of the two, which is funny, red and coalish. Sweden is very red, nuclear. Spain, interesting, capacity payments in '97, so it's yellow. Italy is yellow, So we have, surprisingly, and we had the Single Market Act in '92. For those of you who remember, the national energy mixes, as Georg had shown, are still very diverse, and that's the way it is. There are three aspects on the European side that I want to highlight, though, and I could read you. Georg mentioned I'm a professor. Usually I read texts. This has 300 pages. I won't read it to you, but I refer to you from time to time. It's part of the marketing effect. There's not the slightest chance that nuclear is part of an economic low-carbon strategy. And the simple reason for this is that nuclear has never been part of any economic electricity mix. A colleague of mine, Ben Wheeler, and myself, we have looked together with a nuclear engineer from France at all of the 674 nuclear reactors, that is all the European ones and all of the rest of the world. So it's not a single one that has ever been built under market economic conditions, which does not prevent Chinese and others of building this, but that doesn't have to do anything with economic, low-cost energy mix. This is also consensus. I looked at hundreds of articles in the literature, and there's not a single one that states the opposite. If anybody of you knows, please give it to me. I'll put it in the next book. There is none. MIT, Chicago, Dazzler, my old friend, agree. Lucas Davis from Berkeley. Economic perspectives of nuclear are hopeless. François Levesque has this nice chart in here that shows the costs of nuclear, referring to what you said. They have been always going up, which does not mean that they will always go up. But for the last 50 years, they have been always going up, and it's unlikely that this will change. My research topic is nuclear decommissioning and nuclear waste. And there's another chart in here that I just want to refer to, because that's something that's often forgotten. Decommissioning is complex. In Germany, there are only 2 of the 30 or so reactors that are decommissioned. And the end of the period where the nuclear waste is stored safely is currently targeted for 2140, which is 120 years from now. I'm part of a research consortium where we discussed this recently, and this is considered to be very optimistic by the engineers. There's another issue that our chancellor raised just yesterday. Coming in this morning, I found this on the first page of the FAZ with respect to net carbon and the idea that you could have net carbon by putting carbon into the ground, which was a funny idea 10 to 15 years ago, but that was abandoned for good reasons. And so Ms. Merkel says in the FAZ this morning, I read this in German, CO2 müsse gespeichert werden, das Entweichen in die Atmosphäre zu vermeiden. So CO2 has to be put in the ground, except, excuse me for the publicity, I've looked at each and every single project of putting CO2 in the ground, and there's not a single one that works. Bienschwalde, Porto Tollo, Road, Belchatov, Compostilla, Don Valley, Killingham, Langomet. It's a failure. It's a disaster. Now people recognize this and they say, yeah, we don't do CCTS. Let's do bioenergy CCTS, except if you don't have CCTS, you can't have bioenergy CCTS. Doesn't make sense. So the most recent gadget is direct air capture, which is a gadget because it assumes that you can take CO2 from the air, from this air, 450 ppm. But if that worked, then it would be much easier and much less costly to do CCTS because you have the full CO2 flow, right? So that doesn't make sense, and I've put some references here, because I think we need to talk about positive reductions of emission. Negative emissions don't exist. Doesn't make any technical sense. There's an issue about the Clean Planet for All strategy that we refer here and that we have worked upon for some time. And that is a phenomenon. I call it a paradox. It's a nuclear power paradox. How can a non-economic technology appear in the reference scenario for a considerable amount? Anybody has any answers to this? Let's talk about it after the lecture, because I would like to know it. And our assessment of a 95% reduced European composition of the electricity mix, in this case it's electricity, is that it's almost 100% renewables. Wind, hydro, little bit of solar. That ends the European setting, but brings me, of course, to issues at the national level. This is not the most recent plan that the German government submitted, but it's the plan of 2010 of the Energiewende. And you can see the glass half full or half empty. I'm an optimist. I see the glass half full. I see that there are two criteria that are fulfilled. One is not fulfilled, the CO2. Excellent point to put pressure here. The reduction of nuclear energy, which is still on the table and is going on relatively quietly, is scheduled for the end of 2022. There have been 8 plans put out in 2011. Last year, one. This year, it's Philipsburg, 2019. And then we have 2 more steps in 2020 and 21 and then 22. So that's no big deal to the extent that there are currently huge overcapacities, prices are low, no problem. The issue that you mentioned, Carol, is coal restructuring. You may have noticed that there was this multilateral commission proposing a closure of the last coal plants by 2038, with an option to move this to 2035. We've done calculations on different types of phase-outs, and like in Poland, it's important to close down the lignite early because it's the most dirty in terms of CO2. So let's take the moderate phase-out would be sufficient to attain the target, which is a correspondent CO2 target. Here it's about 150 million tons. But doing it earlier would make economic sense because it's the cheapest abatement measure. So it would make sense to have a rapid phase out, close down lignite relatively early, and use the hard coal as the transformation fuel. And that would save another 50 million tons for other sectors, for example, transportation. An interesting point that I think we should discuss more is the natural gas phase out. I see different, we can pick this up in the discussion. In Poland, natural gas was going slightly up. France, natural gas was kind of disappearing. Our assessment, and this is our modeling exercise, not the official statement, but it's relatively close, is that natural gas, this red here, under strict carbon constraint, net neutrality, is going to disappear. Now, there are options, of course. There's biogas, and there are other options for other gases, and that's a point of discussion, perhaps also of diversity between the countries. And that's it. If you want to know more, read the book. You can even read it online, but you can also purchase it. And I'm very happy to discuss these issues and others with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christian, for also providing the ground for, I think, a more heated debate on fuel mixes in the different countries. But I think I would leave the discussion on nuclear more for later, or maybe even after the event. And I would now like to essentially get the panel together to discuss a bit on essentially how is coordination between the countries possible, what's the potential benefit, what's the issues essentially that link these countries. Now we have all these national plans that all look different in the direction that they are going, and that all will have implications on each other. So I see a couple of issues there, like on the network side, questions of loop flows and how we organize phase shifters, question of markets, on how carbon markets will react on German or Polish decisions, and how that might affect French or the other way around. In terms of trade, so what are the expected imports and exports of both energy and other goods? And in terms of national capacity, so is this really the mix that we are going to end up with? Is this really somewhat close to an optimal European mix, or is this something that we end up with a system that is completely overbuilt and highly inefficient? So that's, I think, more questions than we can answer today, and I think there's a lot of questions that nobody will have the answer to right now. One observation at the start for me would be that so far I have the impression that from the drafting of the first plans did not yet have any coordinating function, and there was, as far as I understand the Commission idea, the idea was that this NECP drafting would be a trigger for cross-border discussions. And in the resulting NECPs or draft NECPs, I didn't have the impression that we saw that. I would like to go in the order of the speakers to give some thoughts on the points about coordinating member states' national energy and climate plans. Alexandra.
From which topic shall I start? From the last one. When it comes to coordination, cross-border coordination, I think that NECP was for some majority, or at least many countries, a lesson to coordinate inside the government. I think that the necessity to take into account all sectors of economy was for some the first such exercise. And I think that this coordination will come later. It depends on what the Commission says and sees. I cannot tell right now how it can be done. Even if we discuss among ourselves, there's more question marks. The issues that you mentioned before, imports, CO2 prices, flows of electricity and imports of other fuels, it actually means that if you take into account the decision of the one country, you had to change whole the modeling of your exercise, domestic exercise, because when we do any modeling, we need to assume what will happen with German lignite, with French nuclear, Belgian nuclear, some probably Dutch coal, or other capacities in other countries. This all impacts the modeling, the results, and I think that at the expert level we are ready for that. At the governmental level, not yet. I don't even see how to start discussion of that. I understand that there might be some issues like common renewables auctions, that this is the way forward. Of course, this is discussed, this is needed, but it's still rarely seen in the EU. So more question marks on that. I think that on ECP, this is the both exercise for everyone at the moment, and I don't see this coordination, not yet, not yet.
Well, I think that clearly the regional aspects have not been taken into account during the drafting process. I think each country, at least it's true for France, wanted to build a consensus nationally, and the focus has been, I think, the social aspects. It's the case for coal closures, nuclear closures, and the industrial aspects, and then make sure that at the national scale you do not face a strong adequacy issue, but taking very conservative assumptions on the cross-border trade aspects. But obviously 2019 was supposed to be the year when they start coordinating. I'm not sure this is the case. I don't have the exact reason, but maybe it's also because on the national scale, some decisions are not yet finalized. It's probably the case for the German coal phase out. We have elections in Belgium. Perhaps it will come afterwards, but then we will have a very limited timescale. And I know that some people in the power sector are already raising concerns about the adequacy situation beyond 2023, because all we know is that we will lose firm capacities, but we don't know exactly if the national plans fit together, or if everyone is counting on their neighbor to face peak periods and during winter times. So I don't know if the first elements will come from NSOE and the regional adequacy assessments, or from national players, or think tanks maybe, but obviously the governments will probably not be the first one tackling these issues. I mean, for the French part, on the carbon market, I think the government has given up on trying to set up a regional approach. They have spent months, even years, trying to talk to their neighbors, and at some point silence means no, and it doesn't make sense to lose your energy on such topics. So everyone, I think, is making the assumption that there will be no coordinated approach to carbon pricing, and perhaps even, I mean, perhaps a fair assumption would actually be that coal capacities are phased out, potentially without the cancellation of the corresponding quotas. So, a fair assumption could be not to bet on the carbon price to drive the decarbonisation of the power sector.
So what risks do you see from lack of coordination?
Well, first of all, as I said, I'm an optimist, and I did an exam on the European internal market in 1986, and those of you who remember know that we have done huge progress. I mean, we have a integrated electricity market coupling for Central Western Nordel on the Iberian Peninsula, which is working. We have initiatives like the let's call it the CWE, the Nordel market. There's an initiative towards Southeast Europe, which is progressing rapidly, and which should be left alone to deal with capacity issues. There are no capacity issues within the 2020s. There are huge overcapacities. That's why the price is so low. So even though Germany will close down some nuclear plants, there will be the French coal plants, don't worry about the capacities in the 20s. We can talk about the 30s, but the 20s are safe. Going to natural gas, which I think is becoming more interesting, or even more interesting than electricity. I think there's not much progress in joint cooperation in the electricity way. We had these discussions at the time of the CESA project that Georg and myself participated 12 years ago or something. Why don't we create the same market, nodal pricing based, capacity, congestion based for natural gas? It's probably the last chance to save the sector, because if prices remain very high, then the idea of getting LNG in, which is even more expensive, will not work. And the only chance for natural gas to survive is to become cheaper. I'm halfway optimistic about CO2 pricing. If it's not, I mean, we have the ETS, which has a strict target. It's fine. It may not be sufficient, but it's an instrument that is in place. Needs accompaniment in transportation, in housing, etc. You mentioned the 86 euros. In our models now, we take the real social cost of carbon, which is about 200 euros. The real social cost of carbon is about 200 euros, and we use this in our models because we want to have an idea what the real social costs are. I'm well aware that we can't implement this immediately, but I'm modestly optimistic that we're on the right path. But we shouldn't go astray. But we don't want to talk about this now. We can do it later on expensive ways of dealing with issues that can't be resolved economically. If I might just add, because in the preparation we had this issue of cross-border human flows. To go to Warsaw from Berlin takes about 7.5 hours. To go from Berlin to Brussels takes about 7.5 hours. This is ridiculous. We can't save the world if we fly to Brussels and to Warsaw from Berlin. Usually this should take 2.5 hours maximum.
But let's stick with electricity for now and open the discussion on transportation another time. So I would like to open the floor now to you. You have been very patient for your questions. So I would like to remind you that the main topic is electricity mixes in the different countries and the need for coordination between them on a European scale and the risks of not doing that. Please introduce yourself if you make a comment so that we understand where it comes from. Yes, one question from Jean Arnaud.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a very good debate, and I think very highlighting a number of major issues. So I see a lot of parallel between France and Poland, where the debate is mainly to save PGE and EDF, and where you don't think about such important things as energy efficiency. I've not heard a lot about energy efficiency. I have the impression that in France and in Poland, electricity demand will grow all the time, and that there will not be any reduction of consumption. And by the way, it is not the policy of EDF to reduce the consumption of electricity in France if it wants to keep 50% of nuclear share in 2035. And so that's one thing. Energy efficiency, I think, is completely missing in the debate. And second, I would like to know how these national plans have been built inside the country. I think there's a unique opportunity to open completely the discussion about the energy and climate policy in 2035, and to have a discussion which is not between those who know, but also with the population, especially with all these march on climate and things like that. And I have not the impression that any national plan has been built on the basis of a wide consultation of the population and all the people who have something to say. So that's my two questions: energy efficiency, and second, the way these national plans have been built. Before we speak about coordination, because that's another issue.
There's one more question.
Thank you. My name is Peter Wojcik. I'm with the chemical industry here in Brussels. And I listened with great interest. And I heard the remarks of Professor von Hirschhausen on France, spending a state budget on electricity, on nuclear energy, basically. In Germany, it's comparable maybe when you look at the surcharges and taxation that goes to renewables. I think it's in the order of 20 billion per year, going to a fraction of the electricity generation. My question is, there is an adequacy issue hanging in the air with regard to the national plans. Like, when does the electricity, will it be generated? It's not about capacities. It's more about, will there be enough electricity when it's needed? And what happens to the excess electricity? In Germany, as far as I see the relations, basically Germany is an exporting country with regard to electricity, a big exporter. But the volumes that Germany exports is about the volume that it generates by renewables. So the funny thing is, you could ask the question, are the renewables for export? And does Germany earn money with that, or does it lose money with that?
So on energy efficiency.
Thank you for the questions. I mentioned energy efficiency, and I mentioned that this is one of the issues that we see as the most important points that we wanted to highlight in consultation period, that this imports in Poland, even if we know that the average is lower than the EU, that we need to be very precise how we define electricity demand. What we see is that the government took the highest possible path that stems from electrification of heating and transport. We see this is the way for Poland, and we see that this way we can go around the gas. So we see the need, or we can acknowledge there's a need for electricity consumption growth, but we need a justification. And we know that already Ministry of Energy took notice of that, and this will be decreased. So this is one issue. The other issue, energy efficiency, I think that I concentrated on electricity, but there's a huge potential in heating sector in Poland. So if we go to heating, then I think that this is the missing issue in the heating center. Huge potential in individual heating, in individual buildings, even in very inefficient district heating in Poland. For that, we provided, as Forum Energii, we actually published a big heating strategy a month ago, because this is the sector where the problem lies in Poland, with smog, with inefficiency, with high costs, with energy poverty. It's not electricity, but at the same time we see that there might be a growth in electricity demand due to those sector coupling issues, and this needs a well justification. It's not there yet. So this is a missing issue, mainly in energy policy, and that's why it is missing in my presentation to a big extent, but it is something that needs to be tackled. When it comes to coordination, at the moment, coordination, stakeholder involvement, coordination in the stage of drafting. No, it was usual way of drafting between administration. The stakeholders' involvement came later with the public consultation. It was simultaneous, done with energy policy and NECP in Poland. This is what I mentioned. We finished consulting energy policy on the day when the NECP was released. And we know that there will be a cross-border consultation plus the feedback from the Commission. So the society, both expert society and ordinary people, has no idea how this will play out. Will we get new energy policy first, then reaction on ECP from the Commission, then what? So no, it was not a consensus building yet, but I think that there is a demand from Polish people on that because of all the issues I mentioned: electricity prices, air pollution, withdrawal of coal. This is also debated. So there will be a bigger impact. And one issue is this. I won't use this word, but let's say not very good idea of onshore wind phase out. This totally totally disappeared from the drafts on ECP, and from we hear that we will have more onshore wind. So this was the immediate reaction of the public audience in Poland, and the immediate reaction of the government. So I think that there's again the process of learning how to engage the public on that. And the big issue for this will be, I think that there will be 2 or 3 issues in Poland. Phasing out coal in heating for individual households. This is huge. This is needed, but it's highly expensive, and this is the social problem that we are just facing. Phasing out of coal in electricity, plus what to build instead. Is nuke on the table? Do we want more gas or renewables plus storage plus imports? And then imports is Germany capable of importing with lignite and nuclear phase out. There are decreasing export capacities later on. So there are big problems that will be both discussed. I do hope, I'm optimistic too, so I do hope it will be more discussed within society.
Stakeholder involvement in France?
Yes, so first, energy efficiency, I fully agree that it's important. I had 2 slides on it, but perhaps we should do more, and for that I agree with you. In terms of policy measures, it should be the number 1 issue, but our topic was electricity. On stakeholder engagement, at least for France, there has been an extensive consultation during several months, so involving the general public. Everyone could submit its own view on an online platform. There were debates everywhere in France, and so this was an important part of the process, and it is also why it's a lengthy process. And now we are in another consultant stage with formal organizations, so various councils that we have in France. So I think on this side they have tried to have a very broad discussion. You could always improve, but I think it's a good start. So I'm ready to criticize the French government on many aspects, but for this, obviously, they have tried. Maybe on having electricity when it's needed, I don't have a definite view, but clearly we are now moving in a quite convergent direction, as you showed on your graph. So this is good news on one side, but then on the other side, it means that we are going to somehow make worse some of our current issues. So the fact that we have to deal with the periods of very high renewables production, but so if everyone relies on exports or imports, we have a problem. So the need for coordination is actually going to increase, and I think at some point, although we have agreed on the clean energy package and stuff, the market design issues are going to come up again for various reasons, but including, I guess, firm capacities and the need to invest in some capacities. So any capacity, be it nuclear or anything else, I'm really not pushing for one option or the other. But in any case, for all investments, you seem to have a problem with the current market design. So then it's not about really coordination, but clearly EU energy policy.
Christian, on the Last question. May I add one in terms of should, in the end, ENTSO-E the one that is essentially assessing the adequacy of everything, or should there be the European Commission, or who would, or should you are saying the market is essentially taking care that we have adequacy? Do you have any take on what is the coordinating function?
Yeah, that referred to the last question. Just briefly, there are 2 points. The responsibility for adequacy is technically, of course, with the network operators. My personal opinion is that it does not make much sense to make them profit-oriented because becomes too expensive. It should be ISOs. And then the national governments and probably not Jean-Arnold, but some regional coordinator is taking the responsibility and should implement capacity instruments. That has been done for 150 years, and there's nothing dirty about it. It's just a matter of managing this. And that also refers to the question on the pricing. I think we need to separate the pricing. What you want as a heavy industries is, of course, subsidized electricity. That's your right because you provide jobs. And this has been the way since the 1860s. Heavy industry, energy-intensive industries has always been subsidized by household consumers in Europe. In India, it's different. It's vice versa. And that's okay. Refers me to a presentation Georg gave 2 days ago in Berlin on the need to take into account social and distributional aspects. But I think this is okay as long as the price tendency is upward, because we don't want to have the rebound effect and waste. And as someone else mentioned, increase electricity consumption or energy consumption beyond what's reasonable. Just for Jean-Arnold Vinois, on the participation and the contribution of large stakeholders, I think, but I'm probably too optimistic after all, I think we've made huge progress. Think of the past, and that's only 10, 15 years ago. I think Hilprecht was the head of unit at the time, when we tried to come up with questions: how much capacity does Europe have? Where are the electricity lines? And everybody said, this is too dangerous to disclose. And I have the documents, you have them, and that's only 15 years ago. Today, I just come from a meeting with the Commission where we discuss open data. Everything's transparent. Georg and everybody can look up capacities, etc., make calculations, have different assumptions, of course, which leads to an open debate. So my feeling is that I'm not worried about participatory aspects in this NECP project. And once again, thank you very much for having developed this. You just need to finish one work, that is to avoid Nord Stream 2.
So I wouldn't want to have a discussion on that right now. I think the word before was a good last word, in the sense of saying that the NECPs indeed provide us now transparency of what different countries' internal discussions stand. And in that sense, they are a big step from where we were before. Also in the sense that they now acknowledge the role of member states in shaping the electricity mixes of the countries, which before was assumed to be left to the market, but at the same time left to the governments. I think now it's becoming more clear that the countries have a significant role to play, and putting those plans out there in the open and discussing them is exactly, I think, what the Commission had in mind of doing. I think both on the think tank level, but also on the member state level, now is the time to use those documents and discuss more essentially what the critical issues are, where the linkages between the different plans are, and how to optimize them. My worry is that from what I understand today from the presentations is, so far the plans have been very much focused on the individual member states' national consensus and have not been opened up the discussion. There is a high risk that it stays like that, and that we just stay with the national energy and climate plans, and therefore it's a role of think tanks and of policymakers and all stakeholders to essentially make sure that this proposal by the Commission to have a discussion on NECPs is taken up, and that we get to a more coordinated and more optimized European system. I would like to close here and thank you all for participating. I hope it hasn't been too technical. I hope we see you again soon, and thank you very much.